Good afternoon. My name is Richard Ammons, and I'm a member of the board of the Episcopal Parish Network. Thanks for joining us for this conversation on starting an endowment and how important they are to future ministry. EPN is pleased to present this workshop in partnership with the Episcopal Church Foundation. We look forward to sharing additional workshops on raising money for endowments in the near term. Please know we recognize that the experiences discussed in this workshop might not represent the breadth of experiences in all churches. However, we hope you garner insights that will spark conversation within your teams and leadership groups. We ask that you post your questions or comments in the Q&A feature here, and our panel will try to get to them throughout the session. I will now turn it over to Ann Richardson, who will introduce all of our guests.
Thank
Thank
you so much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone, and we are delighted to be having this conversation today about what to think about when preparing for an endowment. So my name is Ann Richardson, and I am the Senior Program Director for Investor Relations at the Episcopal Church Foundation, or ECF, and I am joined today by Karsten Sierk, who is the Director of Endowment Management and my colleague at ECF. Karsten and I have led several webinars over the last couple of years, including for EPN. And one of the things that we have learned is that you all like to ask a lot of questions. So we have kept our formal remarks somewhat short for today. It should be about 35 minutes, and that is to allow for sufficient time for the Q&A. So please use that Q&A button that you see on your screen to ask questions. So our topic today is what to think about when establishing an endowment. And at ECF, we have actually heard quite a bit recently from churches who historically had what you might call an aversion to an endowment, but where new leadership, whether that's new lay leadership, new clergy, or both, are leading the congregation to want to better understand what an endowment is, how it can support a church, and what steps they should take to be ready for an endowment gift, or maybe even to encourage an endowment gift. So today we're going to cover all of this and more with the goal of helping you understand how an endowment fits into your overall financial and asset picture. And we hope demonstrating that getting better about talking about money at church and what money makes possible can lead to greater openness, increased transparency, and even more generosity in your parish. So before we get started on our actual topic, I did want to take just a moment to give you some background on the Episcopal Church Foundation, or ECF, for those of you who are not familiar with us. The Episcopal Church Foundation is an independent nonprofit, and our sole mission is to support Episcopal organizations. We have offered endowment management services to Episcopal organizations for over 25 years. Investment management is certainly a core aspect of endowment management, and we do offer investment management services. But at ECF, we believe that to truly have effective endowment management, you need to surround investment management with appropriate structure and governance and a plan to encourage new gifts. It's all three of these aspects that are critical to successful endowment management. And at ECF, we offer comprehensive services covering all of these areas. We have worked with hundreds of churches over the years, and today, on behalf of the more than 350 Episcopal churches, diocese schools, and nonprofits who have entrusted us with their funds, we now manage well over 650 million in assets. So as we cover our topic today, you will hear us refer to church or parish or vestry, Please know that the same principles that we are covering also apply if you are joining on behalf of an Episcopal diocese, an Episcopal school, or another organization and their boards. And we are always very happy to hear from any Episcopal organization to learn about your goals and discuss how we might help. So let's get right into our presentation today. And again, we're talking about what to think about when establishing an endowment. And we are going to cover this topic by talking through 5 steps. First, know what an endowment is and what it could offer you. Second, understand the principles that are there to safeguard endowment funds and how to codify those in your policies. Third, identify people who can serve on an oversight committee. Fourth, articulate a vision or a purpose for the endowment. And fifth, plan your communications to build awareness, interest, and trust. Of course, we absolutely recognize that preparing for an endowment will not and does not have to follow these steps in a linear fashion. We had to organize our remarks in some way, and this is what we chose. But we recognize and are very experienced in understanding that all of these steps tend to operate in parallel, or sometimes you might start near the end and come back to the beginning. What's more important than following these steps in this order is simply ensuring that you address all 5 of these areas. It's covering each topic that will put your parish in the right position to be ready for an endowment. So up first is understanding what an endowment is and what it offers. So an endowment, a permanent endowment, is money that is given for the long term. In the legal definition, a permanent endowment is money that a donor has given you, where the donor specifies this money is not wholly expendable on a current basis. So if we think about the donations that we make to our church normally, right, we expect the church to use that donation. Our pledges that we make are current gifts that will be spent to ensure the continuation of the church's important work this year. An endowment gift is different. It is a gift that the donor intends for you to preserve. A vestry could also designate some of its funds for the long term, thinking of them like an endowment. Maybe you receive a bequest from a parishioner, and that bequest simply comes to the church with no other qualifications or restrictions. That bequest is the last gift that you will receive from that parishioner, and often it is the largest single gift that they will make to the church. Many vestries choose to designate these funds as endowment and spend only a part of them. What is common between these 2 types of endowments is that they are for the long term. They are to provide for your ministries both today and tomorrow. And so because endowment funds have what you might call a long-term or even a perpetual time horizon, they need to be invested to grow and earn so that you have funds for both today and tomorrow. Ultimately, the goal that you are looking to achieve is to enable a distribution, often an annual distribution, of some amount of these funds so that you can carry out your mission and ministry while also preserving the value of the gift over the long term. So to sum up in very simple terms, endowment is money that is invested to provide for the continuing support of an organization, and that support comes from typically an annual prudent distribution. Now, those endowments that are created by donors are governed by a state law called the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, or UPMIFA. This law has been passed in nearly all states, and it guides fiduciaries like the vestry in their responsibilities for endowment funds, particularly those permanent endowment funds, again, those created by donor intent. We are not going to go deeply into this law today, but we will reference it a few times. And as you get ready for an endowment at your parish, it's important for you to know that this law exists. So with that basic understanding of what an endowment is, why have an endowment at a church? When we think about what endowments offer churches, we could summarize that in three areas. The first would be, of course, support for your mission and ministry. In our experience, churches use endowment for so many things. They might use it for formation opportunities for all ages, for music, for outreach ministries, to help repair and preserve their building and grounds. Really, any area of ministry could be supported by your endowment. The goal is that these funds help you carry out the tremendous work that you do. The second thing that an endowment offers a church is improved financial stability. So, as I've said a couple of times, spending from an endowment is typically done through an annual distribution of some of the funds, what's often called an annual prudent distribution. And MIFA, that state law that I mentioned, actually outlines 7 factors that those overseeing endowments must take into account when determining how much is prudent to spend. Typically, those who oversee endowments, the fiduciaries, make a determination of an annual amount that is something between 3% and 5% of the endowment's value. And then usually this distribution is determined ahead of the year so that then the vestry will know that a certain amount of money is planned to come in, and that can give the vestry more certainty in making their plans for the next year. Finally, and importantly, an endowment can also enable innovation at your church. If having this endowment means that you now have funds that you wouldn't otherwise have had, you can experiment. You can try something new and see how the parish reacts. You can see if it's a ministry that might be worth continuing through additional other funding or fundraising. Really importantly, especially I think for this group that's with us today, endowments can be started from gifts of any size. At ECF, our minimum to invest through us is $10,000. Every endowment starts somewhere, and time works in your favor. So you don't need to have a lot of money or even a lot of people to be a church with an endowment. What you do need to have is a plan for governing endowment funds when they arrive and a vision for how they'll be used. And that's what we're talking about today. So now I'm going to turn to Karsten to take us through the principles for safeguarding endowment funds.
Thank you, Anne. Excuse me. Thank you, Anne. So Anne just gave us definitions and meaning, and here now are 5 general principles that apply to endowments regardless of the specific type of endowment fund you have. So that's regardless of where it came from or what you are going to use it for. And if you keep these concepts in mind as you plan for your new endowment, it will help you be as effective as possible as you gain and maintain these funds for your long-term missional use. And of course, that's the point at the end of the day. So first here, protection. This is about preserving the fund and specifically the purchasing power of the fund over the long term. To do that, as Anne mentioned, you must invest in a manner that allows a degree of spending each year while you preserve the value of the fund. Protection is rooted in that state law that Anne mentioned, which includes requirements and guidelines around both investing and spending, and you can dig more deeply into that when you're ready. But you're going to want to let church leaders and possible donors to your fund know now that you will have a plan in place to protect these funds. The next is balance, and that goes back to what we said earlier about endowments providing funds for mission both today and tomorrow. This means that you do not favor the present, spending significantly right now, nor do you favor the future, holding off all spending until later. You're going to do a little bit of both. Following that is prudence, as Anne mentioned. Being prudent is the standard that you will follow when investing, and it's also the standard that typically guides spending. There are a variety of considerations that go into what is prudent, and there is not a single answer to what is prudent. What's important to know now is that prudence must always guide you, but you can figure out what is prudent specifically for your church at any point in time. Next, oversight, which reminds us that a church does not need to invest these funds themselves, and actually they should not. The church will establish a strategy for its endowment, which is the overall investment framework, and you're going to set that in connection with what your church is trying to accomplish. And then the church can engage an investment partner to provide endowment management services within the strategic parameters that you set for the manager. At ECF, we are the investment advisor for about 350 churches across the country. Many dioceses also offer investment options for their churches, and there are other places to look. So to recap, though, the idea is that the church retains ultimate fiduciary responsibility for the funds, but delegates the day-to-day investment decisions. And then the church oversees that delegation, which is the implementation of the framework that it has put in place, the implementation of that framework by the investment partner that it has selected. Finally, here you see the principle of transparency. And this one is not rooted in law like the others, but it's one that we at ECF always include because transparency is so important to building trust in financial management at a parish. And churches have not always been as transparent as they could be. For endowment funds, this means the idea of transparency around endowment funds means sharing how the funds are invested, being clear about how much is available for distribution to be spent and how that's decided. And then it's also about periodically communicating about how the endowment funds are used and the impact that they are having. So that's 5 general principles to keep in mind. You can document these governing principles, and you should, in a set of endowment policies. At ECF, we spend a lot of time on good governance, and we know that good governance based on written policies is essential for a successful endowment, and a successful endowment, of course, is one that continues to support mission year after year, and that also builds trust and participation among the congregation. So to do this, we recommend that churches put in place the following policies. First, vestry resolutions, shown here as enabling resolutions, which the vestry passes to establish the fund and to establish the oversight committee, which is typically called either an endowment committee or an investment committee. Next, you need an operating plan for that committee. How many members, when they meet, what their responsibilities are, how they report back to the vestry. Then you see here a gift acceptance policy, which sets out guidelines for any gifts offered to the church so that you have a plan in place for gifts before you're offered them. And that's interesting because on one hand, for example, you typically will want to put bequests that come to you in cash in an endowment. That's often a default policy for a church. But on the other hand, if someone gives you, let's say, real estate, you probably don't want to accept that until you have taken a close look at the property, whether you can use it or sell it, and whether it comes with any liabilities and so on. So these policies help guide you when you are offered gifts, as I know you will be. And then finally shown here is an investment policy statement, often known as an IPS. This guides the committee when it selects and oversees an investment partner. And we recommend that it also include a spending policy. And we put it here because spending is related to investing. And that spending policy makes clear at the outset how annual spending from the endowment will be determined. Often churches will finish up this part of their policies once they actually have the funds to invest, and will also put the final touches on that IPS in tandem with their investment partner. That's something that we spend a lot of time on at ECF when churches decide to invest with us. So here again are the benefits of this approach. Governance is absolutely critical to gaining gifts. Policies like these that outline how you will manage the endowment help you build trust among parishioners that you will oversee their gift thoughtfully and appropriately. Also, if you clarify who does what with respect to the endowment, that can reduce some possible unease or concern. And the sample policies that we have here at ECF outline very clearly the responsibilities of various bodies, including the vestry, the committee, the investment manager. And then again, there's the idea of using an outside investment manager. In today's market environment, it is just not generally practicable for a committee to seek to manage endowment funds itself. When certain responsibilities are then delegated, the committee's role is to review the manager's implementation of the stated policies. So policies are a critical anchor for that as well. We have talked a lot about the committee. So you might ask, who should be on this committee? Certainly our experience at ECF shows us that the most successful endowments have committees that recognize the gravity of their duties and who are engaged not only in overseeing the endowment, but are also willing and able to promote the endowment fund, to explain its purpose and its impact. And at first, obviously, that's going to be its intended impact, and then later, it will be its actual impact that the endowment has had, and to explain this both to the vestry and to the full congregation. The right people on this committee can make the difference between an endowment that is impactful, transparent, sustainable, trusted, and an endowment that exists quietly or secretly. The congregation doesn't know anything about it. They don't make any additional gifts. That is a huge missed opportunity, and the right people can make the difference. I also just want to note here that your committee members should bring a range of experiences and perspectives to the committee. We often find that churches feel compelled to put financial people on the endowment committee. Certainly, having a couple of members with investment knowledge or an interest in the financial markets is beneficial. But the most important attributes of committee members is that they are committed to your community and committed to this committee, a lot of C's there, and that they are both curious and responsible, and that they are willing to engage with church leaders and with parishioners about the endowment. There's also no one right size for a committee, and certainly 3 effective members can be far more impactful than a larger group that is not all that engaged. Looking at the slide here, so effective committees, as we've talked about, they stay focused on strategic issues for which knowledge of the church is critical. They delegate the investment detail within the parameters that they set. They review and report. This is essential and meaningful work. Review takes time, and reporting is very much how you frame the purpose of the endowment inside the culture of your church. The most effective committees, as we keep mentioning, realize they have this expanded role. It's more than just looking at quarterly returns. It includes discussing and promoting the endowment. And finally, plan for some turnover in the committee. That is not something to spend a lot of time on yet with a new endowment, but just know that it is healthy over the long term. Last fall, Anne and I presented a webinar on effective investment committees. And if you're interested in watching the replay of that webinar, please reach out to us. Our contacts are at the end. We will be happy to send you the link to that. So now I'm going to turn it back to Anne for step 4.
Thank you so much, Karsten. So alongside developing your governing policies and your committee, it is worthwhile to give some thought about why an endowment for your parish. We've obviously said several times now that an endowment is for the long term, and endowments are an excellent way for churches to ensure that the gifts that they receive will benefit the community for years to come. But that only will be a reality if there's a direct line from the mission of the church to the vision of the endowment. When you seek new gifts for an endowment, what you are really inviting your parishioners to do is to think about the next 20, 30, or 50 years of your church. Why should they make a gift to sustain the mission and ministry of your church into the future, above and beyond the gifts they already give you to make possible your mission and ministry today? So the questions on this slide will help you think about why you're establishing an endowment, the benefits that you hope it will provide, and the impact that you want it to have. And I believe that there is a real advantage to doing this type of work ahead of receiving any endowment gift, because by thinking through this ahead of time, that enables the church to establish the purpose of the endowment for itself and then to invite gifts toward that purpose, rather than having the purpose defined for you by the first donor who makes a gift. So let's just walk through an example of what I'm thinking of here. So let's say that at your church, you've been having a lot of conversations about your physical plant and the funds required for general upkeep. I'm sure this sounds familiar to a lot of you. And maybe you're especially talking about big ticket projects that only come along once in a while. Perhaps it's a new roof, upgraded HVAC, a steeple replacement. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we have to do for our churches to maintain our properties. So capital maintenance and capital improvements are an area that can be handled outside annual budgets sometimes and outside annual giving. Where are those funds going to come from? In many cases, vestries establish an endowment to fund building and property maintenance and maybe even building and property improvements. So let's say that the vestry decides to create such a fund, and I'll just, for being short in this example, call it the campus fund. And in the governing documents of this fund, those documents that Karsten outlined, it sets out a very plainly stated purpose. The purpose of the campus fund is to fund building and property maintenance and improvements. That's very important, and it's important to be clear and plain in your governing documents. But how do you turn that phrase into a vision that will help your congregation understand why a fund like this is important? Effectively, what you are doing is taking the purpose of the endowment and presenting it in a way that connects to your church's mission. And I want to say that this is not some sort of onerous multi-month strategic planning task, but it does mean spending, just a little bit of time thinking about the relationship between the endowment's purpose and what you do at your church. So in the example of the campus fund, maybe you end up crafting a vision that is something like, our campus provides a home for worship services, for fellowship and formation for all ages, and for community service, including a food pantry, daily meetings of recovery groups, and as one of the rotating weekly winter shelters in our town. The Campus Fund supports these ministries and all of our mission and ministry by covering some of the costs of operating and maintaining our building and grounds so that we can continue to welcome our community to our space. Ideally, all of your church leaders, and that includes your clergy, your vestry, your finance committee, but even all of your ministry leaders will own this endowment vision, will understand how the purpose of the endowment connects to your mission, and be able to present it to the parish in a way that connects. So speaking of presenting to the parish, planning your communications is this very important final step on the journey to being ready for an endowment. So your goal in communicating about endowment plans is to build awareness for your plans about the endowment, to generate interest in why you are doing this, and then to inspire trust in how you are going to govern and oversee these funds. This last step to readiness, planning your communications, is often, in our view, the crux of success. You can adopt appropriate governing policies, you can set up a functional committee, you can adopt a meaningful vision and purpose, but if you don't communicate well about what you're doing and why, you will miss the opportunity to engage the broader parish and open the door to gifts. At ECF, we often say that endowments grow incrementally through investment returns and exponentially through new gifts. So how are you inviting the parish to understand the role of endowment at your church and also to be a part of it? So at a minimum, we would say that your parishioners should understand three things about your endowment: that vision that you've developed, the purpose for the endowment, the difference that you expect the endowment to make, and then, of course, how they can make a gift. So communicating the why of the endowment is the emphasis here, and it is so important. Your parishioners need and want to know how the endowment is going to connect to your mission and ministry. And tied right in with that is saying something about the difference that you expect the endowment to make. The impact of the endowment comes from distributions, as I said earlier, from spending some of the funds to enable mission and ministry today while conserving and protecting to be able to have funds for tomorrow. One of the ways that we see churches commonly communicate about their endowment or about a new gift for an endowment is to focus on the overall size of that gift. But talking only about the overall size of the gift or of the endowment really obscures the impact and can be somewhat confusing for people who aren't familiar with how endowments work. Let's say that you have grown your endowment and it reaches $1 million. I mean, that is an incredible asset for a church. And what it means practically is that, maybe $40,000 annually or so will be available to help support your mission and ministry. That is a terrific amount of money that will likely make some new things possible. It's also, for most churches, not going to cover everything that you do. So communicating about what you can prudently spend from the endowment and what that makes possible will help your parishioners better understand the impact that the endowment has each year. And importantly, and I think I have said this before on some of the webinars that we've done, the endowment does not operate in a vacuum, right? So as you've been making these plans to get ready for an endowment, you have been thinking about how is this asset going to fit in with all of our church's other assets. So be articulate about this when you communicate with the parish. If your endowment distribution will go into your annual budget, how will that expand the possibilities of what you can do? If you are going to take draws only occasionally because you've decided the endowment is for capital improvements, be clear about that and why you made that decision. Communicating your endowment plans and goals in the context of all of your mission and ministry, all of your assets, and all of the ways that parishioners make that possible through their pledges, through their lending of expertise, and through their volunteer time is what is going to help connect these concepts for your parishioners. And then, of course, part of communicating will be letting people know how to make a gift. In our experience, most endowment gifts come in the form of a bequest or another type of end-of-life legacy gift. While you will certainly want to offer a list of how someone might want to make a gift, that is really only after you have communicated the why of making the gift. The church, the vestry, the committee are not expected to be, nor should they be, estate planners for parishioners. What you are expected to be able to do is to remind those who are sitting in the pews with you why your parish is a worthy recipient of their generosity, both now and later. So that covers the 5 areas that we believe you should work through to get ready for an endowment. You should certainly know what an endowment is and have an idea of what such a fund could offer your church. Karsten talked about the principles that will safeguard your endowment funds and how to codify those in policies. And she also identified some of the key attributes of the people that you will want to have on the oversight committee, whether that's what you would call an endowment committee or an investment committee or your finance committee. And then you'll certainly want to articulate a vision or a purpose for the endowment, and then plan your communications. Again, such a crucial step to make sure that all 4 of the other steps that you've taken matter and bear fruit. So we will be getting into questions in a moment. And again, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can put your questions. And so while we await those, Karsten is now going to turn to a few practical aspects of what we've talked about today.
Sure, thanks, Anne. So I do see we have some questions. Just give us one more moment here. We've covered big concepts, and I want to just take a moment on some very practical matters. First, when is a good time to get started? And quite frankly, it's when you have 1 or 2 people committed to seeing this process through from start to finish. If those people understand the concepts and have a vision, they can then build consensus and oversee necessary action. Without a few key leaders ready to do some heavy lifting, it can get a little bit tricky. If funds arrive, we'll get to that in a moment, before you are ready, well, you are very lucky. But that means sometimes there can be a little bit of a scramble to put everything in place. We help churches with that all the time, but it's really ideal to get started before then. Next is, what should we discuss at a church? And I would start, just as Anne was saying, with what an endowment is and what does it offer, and then move right along to what your church's vision for an endowment should be. And that might lead to some interesting conversations, but that can be healthy and clarifying, and indeed might help you right away build consensus and set the right tone. Third, the ever-pressing question, and we're actually going to get to that with some of the questions that come in as well: where does the money come from? So 2 places. The funds will come from the church, or they're going to come from a member of the church who is deeply committed to the church, often because of the impact that the church has had on them. And they're also committed to the future role of the church in its community. So just to take those 2 situations, if funds come from you, that would be the case if, let's say, you have a surprise bequest. The bequest is made just to the church with no language of any other kind around that, and the vestry decides to place those funds in an endowment, and that certainly is a good practice. Or they come from a member of your parish, basically a donor to your church, who says, I give you this gift to help support the church forever, or for an endowment in perpetuity, or similar language. And when we look at gifts from a member of the parish, occasionally it comes as a surprise. You got lucky again, but that luck is really built on the hard work over many years of being a committed church family, so that people have an emotional connection to you. But gifts from donors can also come with your effort to envision and promote the endowment, your direct work to share information about the endowment and explain how to make a gift and to really inspire those gifts. Finally here, what do you have to have in place to be ready for a future gift? It's everything in these slides: understanding and vision and communication and policies. And we hope that this presentation today gives you the roadmap to get started. I want to turn right away to a couple of questions that will relate to some of this. So Anne, maybe I'll read a few back to you. So one is, does it make sense to have multiple endowments with multiple purposes? And then a related question is, what if we want to set up an endowment that's specifically for an organization inside our parish, separate but different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think depending on the context of your church, it can absolutely make sense to have different endowment funds, right? Some churches like to have a broad bucket and encourage gifts into a very broadly purposed fund. In other churches, in their context, setting up funds for specific purposes makes more sense. And then, of course, if you have a parishioner who gives you a gift and says, this is my endowment gift for music, if you accept that gift, then you must only spend it on things that are related to music and not spend it on something like paving the parking lot, for example. So it depends a little bit on what you're hoping to do. This is part of why I was saying articulating the vision of the endowment can be so helpful, because if you set up a fund or a few funds for yourselves, right? Perhaps you can envision that there will be a fund for building and grounds, a fund for music, a fund for outreach. You can encourage the parish to donate into those funds and avoid a situation where a parishioner gives you a gift with purpose restrictions on it that just don't make sense or aren't going to be able to be fulfilled over a long-term or perpetual time horizon. Similarly, if you've got, an organization within your church, perhaps you also run a school, maybe you run a preschool, maybe you have an associated nonprofit. I mean, you can certainly direct and create funds that will direct gifts solely for those purposes. You could create a fund that would benefit only the preschool, for example. Something that I think is really important for leaders to be conscious of is how long they think the preschool will be viable. Because of course, once you no longer have the preschool, right, if your town is not growing, if you're not engaging young families in your area, right, maybe the preschool has a 20-year lifespan and then closes. If you have a fund specifically for the preschool, you're going to have to think about where does that go so that it can fulfill its purpose, which was really the formation and education of young children.
I'll just say, if you're steering, if you have the vestry, you're steering the whole ship. I mean, I think you want to, ideally every organization, not just churches, They want funds that give them the most flexibility to meet future needs, which might be knowable and they might be unknowable yet in the present. Sometimes donors like to give money for a specific purpose. And so in the best situation, you're having a conversation together and encouraging the donor to be expansive, but also being respectful that they might have areas of interest, and hopefully come to a happy medium. One thing when you have multiple funds is you can invest them all together and track them separately. There are ways to manage multiple funds to reduce the complexity of oversight. I want to switch gears, Anne, if I may, and ask you questions that are more directly around the giving side first. Can you explain the connection between an endowment fund and a legacy society?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, some churches have decided that they want to recognize donors to an endowment fund in a particular way. And sometimes churches do that by creating what is called a legacy society, which is effectively a recognition mechanism, right? It's a way of acknowledging the people who have made this commitment, who have shown their commitment to the long-term health of your church. Could be that the legacy society is recognized through an annual listing of names, right, of people who have made a commitment to give to St. Mary's Endowment or whatever your church is called. It may be that you have particular events that are sponsored by that legacy society that are on the topics that are related to the endowment or are about inviting others to also remember the endowment. So a legacy society is at some churches a way to recognize people who have given or have committed to give to an endowment fund. The endowment fund, of course, is the money itself.
Yeah. And as you're thinking of ways to gain gifts, having a legacy society and making it interesting and compelling and talking about it, whatever, it's just another tool you have to create a culture of giving in your church.
And I would say also a culture of gratitude, right?
Yes.
So if you don't have a practice already, for example, of recognizing your parishioners who give for pledges, right? You need to think about what is your practice of gratitude for people giving in all the ways they're giving now? And also, how will you fold the endowment into that? You don't want to thank the people giving to the endowment if you never thank the people giving their annual pledges, right? So it's got to fit in the context of your church. And it gives you a chance to think about, you know what, maybe we should do all of our gratitude practices a little bit differently now that we're thinking about the endowment. Maybe there are ways that we can be more grateful for all the gifts that our parishioners give to us.
Yeah. Here's one about different types of endowments, and I'll just answer it quickly, Anne, and then give you the next one. The question, there's several of them, is about the difference between a permanent endowment fund, which is also sometimes called a true endowment fund, and a quasi-endowment fund. What's the difference? Which one do you want? So a permanent or true endowment fund is only created when a donor, a member of your congregation, gives you a gift and says, this gift is for perpetuity or for an endowment. They can use all types of language there. Don't get hung up on the language. It's the intent. When you get a gift like that, if you accept it, you must manage it to last in perpetuity. You may only spend a certain amount each year to ensure that you're not spending it down and using it up too fast so that it lasts. So there's a little bit heavier guidelines there. A permanent endowment can still be for any purpose, music, outreach, operations, anything. A quasi-endowment is an endowment that a vestry sets up. And a vestry might set it up when it has a gift that isn't designated for anything. It's just a bequest, $500,000 to you, period, end of sentence. You might decide to put that in an endowment. If the vestry creates the endowment, it is only a quasi-endowment. You can treat it as much like as a permanent endowment as you want. We certainly encourage that. But at the end of the day, you could also pass another vestry resolution ending it as an endowment, right? So whatever you create, you could uncreate. You don't want to do that, honestly. The key feature of a quasi-endowment is that you could build into your policy the ability to spend a little bit more than that prudent amount each year if there is some circumstance that you meet. And sometimes it might be a dire emergency, or you might have a provision. You don't have to, but you might have a provision. Well, we can spend more deeply from our quasi endowment if we have a capital need. And you might put some parameters. We have to vote twice or things like that. But it gives you a little more flexibility. The ideal situation for any church, any charity, any nonprofit is to have funds where they have the most flexibility and yet have the self-control not to take advantage of that flexibility. So that's the dream situation. Your donors are still going to do things that they want. And for some donors, creating a permanent fund is what's crucial. Some churches already have the permanent fund in place. You can have a permanent and a quasi, by the way. Okay, Anne, I'm going to come back to you. There is a question. I don't want to get too hung up on percentages, but we got a question about the 3 to 5% that you mentioned. Is that annual returns or is that the spending amount? And how does the amount you spend, 3 to 5%, compare to what you're thinking about as an annual return to the fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I said people usually spend about 3 to 5%, that represents the distribution, the spending amount. And that is common across all sorts of endowments at colleges and universities, at other nonprofits, at churches. The way that you think about a prudent distribution is based on several factors, including the long-term expected returns from your investments, long-term expectations for inflation, and then the fees that you pay, right? So if you are invested in a portfolio that you expect over a long period of time, right? Not every year, not even every 3 years, but over the long term to earn maybe 7%, which would be a sort of somewhat realistic expectation for a diversified portfolio over long periods of time. And then inflation is maybe 2% over a longer term time horizon. And your fees are 1%. Again, I'm just using simple numbers for simple math. So if you earn 7% on your investments, you take away 2 for inflation. Again, you're trying to preserve the purchasing power of the fund, and you take away 1 for your fees. That's 7 minus 2 minus 1, that's 4%. Again, there are other factors that should be taken into account when anyone who is a fiduciary of a permanent endowment thinks about spending. Those are the ones that are most easily assigned a number. And typically, most endowments, when they are looking at spending prudently, meaning spending in a way that preserves the purchasing power of the fund, they typically spend somewhere between 3 and 5% of the overall total value of your endowment. So again, if you have a $1 million market value endowment and you spend 4%, that is $40,000 each year.
I'm going to go back to Legacy Society again. Who should become a member of a legacy? Like, what type of gift do you have to have made? Does it have to be a planned gift? Does it have to be a gift for the endowment? Could it be a planned gift for the present moment? Could it be a different type of endowment gift?
So it's up to you, right, at your church, how you want to recognize people. What I would say is typically a legacy society is about recognizing gifts either that are to the endowment or are that are commitments to make a bequest at the end of life, some kind of end of life legacy gift. You don't typically call it a legacy society to recognize a current gift right now for current needs. It is something about funding the future of the church, whether that's going directly to an endowment fund or maybe just a bequest that will go to the church that the donor wants the church to decide what to do with it at that time. And I would say that you should recognize people both if you're going to do this, and not all churches need to do it, and it's not appropriate at all churches. But if you are going to create a legacy society, you should think about recognizing both people who commit to make legacy gifts to an endowment or overall to the church, and also recognize people who make current gifts to the endowment. People's financial situations are different. Some people may find that giving at the end of their life is the thing that they can do. Other people may find that giving right now to the endowment is what they can do. And you have the opportunity to say thank you. Again, the whole point of a legacy society is simply recognition and gratitude. So the more people that you can extend that thankfulness to, I think the better.
Here's another one on this idea of giving and plan giving. If a church has an actual plan giving committee to sort of oversee how these types of gifts are discussed and promoted,
yeah,
should that committee include somebody who's not a member of the parish but has special expertise, a lawyer, a financial advisor?
I mean, it certainly could. I mean, if you've got someone from your community who would be willing to help you out in that way, I think it could be very helpful, again, depending on your community and the types of information that parishioners are seeking to have that type of outside expertise. Again, I would emphasize what I said earlier, which is that the church itself is not expected to be, nor should it be, an estate planner for its parishioners. What you can do is talk about the meaning of an endowment in your context. You can remind people that, there's no one coming to save us, right? If we want this church to exist, we are the ones who will fund this church along with those who come after us. And if we we have benefited, our church building is here today because of the vision and leadership of those who came before us, who built the church and raised the funds to do that and have maintained it over all these years. It's our obligation to continue to do that if we believe in this place. And so you can think about communicating to the parishioners the why of doing it, and then connecting them to external people who can help them if they do want to make, have a more complex estate or want help writing a will. I mean, sometimes parishioners are very grateful to know about those resources, but that's not the primary purpose of the church.
Yes, and I would just keep all recommendations at arm's length. You don't ever want to get into a situation where it feels like the church is maybe really encouraging a gift. It's just got to all be super neutral, and you want to make sure that the potential donor has independent advice and is making the right choice for that person. But I want to ask another question, Anne, about professional advisors. There's a question here: when you're setting up an endowment fund, do you need to bring in lawyers? When do you need to bring in lawyers? And I'll give that to you, but if you want to give it back to me.
I mean, I'll say a few words, but you probably have a more expert answer. I mean, I would say you certainly can. You don't have to. At ECF, we have a set of sample policies that we have used to great effect with many churches, right? We have helped them adapt those policies for their circumstances. And for most churches, those policies will serve without the need to have a lawyer review them. Now, again, we are not lawyers and we are not experts on every state's laws. And depending on how your state corporation law impacts the types of policies that you have to have at your church, or depending on kind of the way that your diocese is structured, there may be more complex situations where having a lawyer review them can be helpful. But there isn't a need to do something complex here. These are assets that can be owned by the church and overseen by the vestry, and you can set them up very simply with an enabling resolution, as Carson talked about earlier. We have some sample language for that. So, I mean, I would never discourage anyone from getting advice if they can, but also I don't think it is necessary in most cases.
Yeah. Okay, good. We're almost at the end of the hour.
We are.
We'll just stop in a moment. We've gotten a couple of questions about whether we have sample endowment policies. Certainly happy to have you contact us about examples of types of gifts that could be given, so we can provide some information there. Certainly we encourage churches to focus primarily on bequests and bequest substitutes, like a beneficiary designation and things. So much can come there before it gets more complex, but we can share information, and we would be very happy to hear from any of you if we can be helpful. I'll let Anne wrap us up officially.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is our contact information on the screen. So please do reach out to either one of us if we didn't fully answer your question today, or if you want to have a conversation, we'd be happy to do that. So as we close today, I just want to say that we are grateful to have had the opportunity to spend time with you. One of my favorite parts of my role at ECF is getting to talk to churches from all around the country and to think with them together about how to address their endowment management needs. So again, please reach out. And as you know, this webinar today has been recorded. The Episcopal Parish Network will post the recording on its website within the next several days. They'll also include the slides. If you have others at your parish that you'd like to share this webinar with, please check their website at episcopalparishes.org for the replay and the slides. So on behalf of both the Episcopal Church Foundation and the Episcopal Parish Network, thank you for attending our webinar today.